Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, Welcome to the Sage Grouse Plan. I'm going to go ahead and give it to Professor Hauk, who's going to do a short introduction, and we're going to get things rolling.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. With me today, I've been asked to set the stage. And the stage is in law and in fact. And I'd like to talk about the law so we're all keyed into what the issue is here. And then Professor Sherry from the Department of Biology here on campus, an ornithologist and a bird expert, is going to talk about the grouse. So what we know is what the framework law is, what the creature is, and then what the plans are. And we're going to hear two polarly different points of view on the plan. One from Randy Spivak, who is with the Center for Biological Diversity, which is perhaps the most aggressive defender, if you will, of endangered species in the country. One of them, certainly. There are others. And the other is Trip Park, who represents the Western Energy Association and is very involved in endangered species issues on the receiving end, the interests of his clients and association members. So they have very different views of this plan. After which, we'll turn it open to discussion, and we hope that you'll have questions. All right. So to begin, we are dealing with one of the most extraordinary creatures in the American landscape, as you'll discover from Tom. It's an icon of where it lives, and it is on a glide path to extinction, to never being ever again. Just the way the passenger pigeon was, Carolina parakeet, the ivory-billed woodpecker, all icons, all gone, all gone. So it's the goneness of this that makes it something of an agony for all involved. And the reasons for the gone are hauntingly similar. They are always the fragmentation and then the loss entirely of their habitats. And so the sage grouse would go over the same cliff, except for a law passed in 1973, the Endangered Species Act, which aimed to arrest the glide and reverse it, bring them back. And it was going to do that in 3 steps. Remember the steps, because these steps are what is at issue here today. The first is you list the species as endangered. Yes, it's endangered. Biologically, there's no doubt this bird is endangered. Second is you then automatically have a series of protections of these listed birds. You can't take them, you can't take their habitats. That's an oversimplification, but this is called the pit bull of environmental law because these requirements have teeth and can be enforced. And then there's a recovery plan that comes next. You bring them back. The good news is that since this act was enacted, we haven't lost another species. The bad news is very few have come back to full recovery. And there's an increasing number of species becoming eligible for protection, waiting to be listed. There are over 1,000 now, so there's this backlog. And there's increasing resentment of the act itself and its application to Western energy and other kinds of resources. So here you have a logjam in numbers and in psychology, really. So Interior tried to break through that logjam with an entirely new mechanism, and they stood the Endangered Species Act on its head. You remember how it began with listing and then moved to protection, moved to recovery? Interior went right to recovery. They said, if you, user groups and states and other agencies want to get together and individuals and create a plan to conserve and recover these species, we'll let you do it, and we won't list, even though it's biologically sound. That is to say, the decision will be biologically sound. They earn listing under the Act. We're not going to do it if you develop adequate conservation agreements. So the trade-off here is obvious. On the one hand, through these conservation agreements, you get buy-in from the affected community and the states, and that's terribly important. And particularly from other federal agencies that have other missions, like producing timber or grass for cattle or whatever. So you get more buy-in by the affected parties across the board. The bad news is, and this is the risk, you've lost the protections of the Act because the species is never listed. So now the federal bars on take are gone. Instead, you've got whatever guarantees are within the plan, within the agreement. They've replaced the protections of the Act. So you can see immediately that this has great potential to work in a cooperative manner, and it has great potential for risk for the species if the plan is not strong and effective. And now we have with the sagebrush the most grandiose, ambitious, multiple states, multiple agencies, multiple industries, multiple parties, dozens and dozens. It's Paris 21 in the climate change. It's everybody in the room mucking around trying to come up with plans that will keep it from being listed, but protect it and bring it back. And if they're good, we have a new model for Endangered Species Act protection in the country. And if this fails, the grouse is gone. And so are hundreds others that are going to go down fighting in the same way. So that's what's at stake. It's really mega. And to now talk about the star of the show, the sage grouse. That's Tom Sherry. Thanks.
So I'm a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. I teach conservation biology, ecology, and evolution. So I've been thinking about species and the history of life and other things for a long time. And so the main point I want to make in my very brief presentation is that this is a real species. It's the product of evolution on the planet for billions of years. And it's not just some kind of abstract center of attention for people who are debating various policy and legal issues. This is a real organism. It's a highly threatened species, as you're well aware now. There were probably 16 million animals 100 years ago. It's down to 200 to 500,000 now. This is a severe decline. The current range is shown in black up in that map of the US and Canada in the upper right. The populations declined by 98% from just 1988 to 2012. The historical range included 16 states plus British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. It's hardly making a blip. There's just a handful of individuals in the Canadian provinces today. It was extirpated from British Columbia by 2013 and 5 US states by that time. And the legal aspects of it, Oliver has talked about. The causes of the decline are basically habitat loss due to agriculture, cattle, wheat, urbanization, humans spreading out throughout the West, fossil fuel development. You can see in the middle slide on the right, gas wells behind a sage grouse on the sagebrush, and habitat fragmentation. What habitat fragmentation does biologically, and this is well known, for example, the greater prairie chicken has been studied very well in this respect, as you lose habitat, the remaining habitat that the animals or plants or whatever are in becomes more and more isolated. You get populations that are isolated and they become vulnerable to inbreeding, loss of genetic variability, and that alone, those genetic problems that can kick in small populations, can cause populations to decline. Climate change potentially is also a player and may become an increasingly important player because sagebrush is very vulnerable to fire. And fire frequency is increasing in the Intermountain West and in these habitats where these animals are. I wanted to just wrap up by showing a video because the sage grouse is a highly specialized species to the sagebrush habitat. It depends on the sagebrush, it feeds on it, so it's an iconic species, but because it is so dependent on that sagebrush habitat, that shrub steppe biome of the western United States. And it also breeds in leks, which are arenas where males come together and strut their stuff and try and attract females and so on. A lot of research has been done on that, for example, by Gail Patricelli at UC Davis. And she has developed, for example, and you may have heard of this, the fembot, the female robot, that she runs into these leks and tries to elicit behaviors from males to test hypotheses about how and why females select mates and so on. So a lot of research on fundamental biological questions is going on with the species. It is a very important species biologically. So I'm going to wrap up with a 2-3 minute video just to give you a little bit of a familiarity with the habitat and so on. A little hokey introduction, but try to get past that.
I think they're here this morning. I don't know if it's too cold, too windy. Don't know. Wish I knew. I was a sage grouse biologist for about 5 years for the state before I took the position I'm in now. So we're in the Sheeprock Mountains of Utah, just under 8,000 feet elevation. This is sagebrush. Sage grouse, they need tens to hundreds of square miles of sagebrush. It's the only thing they eat in the winter, are the leaves of the sagebrush. Can't believe they're not here. The lek is an area where they gather each spring where the males strut. I'm a little surprised that they're not out strutting today. Welcome to wildlife. They don't always cooperate for some reason. Within the Division of Wildlife, we have professional photographers, and so our folks will go out every year in hopes of that perfect morning, that perfect opportunity to capture footage of the lek display. The males will have individual territories. They'll defend that pretty aggressively. The males, they have these yellow sacs that are hidden, and then they inflate those so you get a flash of yellow, and they hurry and release the air out of them. And you can hear it really far away. The strutting is kind of to determine who is the most fit, and then the females can select that individual to follow the offspring.
This is a really unusual species.
Greater sage grouse are a candidate species for listing under the Endangered Species Act. In 2006, we saw a high point in this population out here, and it's been declining since then. One of the concerns we have is the lows of those population cycles keep getting lower, and the highs aren't quite as high as they were. A lot of it's trying to reduce the impacts on the landscape. Just kind of fascinating how well adapted they are to sagebrush, but how fragile they are to disturbance to that sagebrush.
So I'm going to end there. They're an extremely well-adapted species to their environment. They're dependent on the sagebrush, and it's that very adaptation and fitness to that environment that makes them vulnerable when the environment is disrupted, lost, degraded, whatever. And so that's the biology at stake. And let's get into the legal issues.
Morning, folks. I'm Randy Spivak with the Center for Biological Diversity. One sec, because I might need a little technical assistance in how I advance my slides. Great, just when you need it, a tech arrives. All right. Sorry for that interruption. So I have worked on sage grouse, greater sage grouse, directly or indirectly for about a decade. Way back at another organization I used to work for, American Lands Alliance, and can folks hear me in the back? And we brought one of the first listing petitions to protect the bird under the Endangered Species Act. So it's been the last couple of years has been sort of incredible, and Professor Hauk is exactly right, because the plans that the federal governments undertook with all the western states, 11, working on the sage grouse, was unprecedented, Herculean, in fact. I mean, it was rather extraordinary, the amount of time and energy that went into it. And so while I will speak to what's good and also what's lacking in the plans, I don't want to undermine what finally happened after decades of denial to address the sage grouse, and not just the sage grouse, but all the other species that depend on the sagebrush sea. And the sagebrush sea is an extraordinary place. I'm glad that Professor Sherry played that video so you can see a bit about it. It's the high desert, and it covers well over 100 million acres of the West. Have folks sort of gone to Wyoming or Utah or Colorado and great, and seen this landscape, which is varied and stark? I started out as a forest activist with the old-growth forests in the Pacific Northwest, and so it took me a little while driving through these landscapes to see the beauty, but I've come to love it, and they are indeed quite beautiful. From the Painted Rocks in John Day Fossil Beds National Monument in Oregon, and here you can see the sagebrush in front, that plant that we saw before that the sage grouse needs for food, for cover from predators, to hide their eggs. Oh, thank you. Well, that's probably much better, isn't it? All righty. From the Painted Rocks and the John Jay Fossil Beds, this is a national monument in Oregon, to the Jarbidge Wilderness in Nevada. People refer to this landscape as the Big Open or the Big Empty, but it's actually anything but empty. There's well over 350 species of conservation concern, from the beautiful pronghorn to the adorable little pygmy rabbit that you can hold in your hand, to reptiles, amphibians, songbirds, hawks, snakes. It is alive with wildlife. But there are many threats to the greater sage grouse and the sagebrush sea. And Professor Sherry talked a little bit about, and I'm going to give some context here, because the history and the decades that went on that finally came to bring us these federal land management plans and state plans has incredibly important context for how the plans were designed and why we got here. So livestock grazing, 99% of the sage-grouse habitat is open to livestock grazing and cows. And here's a picture, and you can see a lot of this area is arid, high desert, and you can see in the foreground what cows do. They trample the sagebrush. Livestock operators often rip out the sagebrush to make more native grasses for cattle. 50% of the sagebrush sea is invaded to some extent by cheatgrass. This is a highly invasive plant. It outcompetes with native grasses. It was actually brought up from Europe. And cheatgrass is actually highly flammable. So, of course, every ecosystem has a fire regime, but fires have increased in the sagebrush sea. And here's a picture of fire, and when they burn, the burned landscape is then very open to predation by cheatgrass and spread of cheatgrass. It takes hold in the burned landscape. Also, cattle tramples the soil crust, which allows cheatgrass to take hold. So there's this vicious cycle, which climate change exacerbates, of fire, cheatgrass, and a common denominator is livestock, because they do facilitate the spread of cheatgrass. And why the federal plans do acknowledge cheatgrass as a problem and wildfires, the emphasis is more on fire suppression and trying to pull out cheatgrass, but the plans do not actually get to the root cause, which is changing livestock management on federal lands. Of course, energy. The West is very important for fossil fuel development, oil, gas, coal. tar sands, oil shale, and 44% of the sage-grouse habitat is at risk from energy development. And here's a picture of some oil and gas fields, and here's the Jonas Field in Wyoming, 2006 aerial shot. So you can see what some of these developments do to the sage-grouse habitat. And behind all these threats, of course, are powerful industries. Industries who feared the listing of the greater sage-grouse because they feared that would interfere with their business and their profits. So we saw that the range of the sage-grouse, the light green is its historical range, and the darker green is where the sage-grouse is today, although it's highly fragmented. And with the shrinking of the habitat also comes the reduction in the bird populations. And here's a graph from 1960 through 2013, and this is the male population. They're easier to count because you see they hang out looking for girls on their leks, and that's where they attract them with their fancy dance. And so they're easy to count. And you can see the population decline. The state agencies, the fish and wildlife agencies of each state, are responsible for species management. The federal government, the BLM, the National Forest Service, 55% of the sage-grouse range is under federal ownership. That's public lands that we all own. But the responsibility for species, if they're not listed under the ESA, comes with the state agencies, and this is very important. And so for decades, this bird has been in a tailspin of decline, and clearly the state agencies have failed the bird and the other species. So just a quick history here, and again, this portends what the plans look like and how they came about. In 1998, Clayton Braun, who was a staffer with Colorado State Fish and Wildlife, wrote a seminal paper on actually documenting through science the loss and decline and the causes of the sagebrush sea. And in 1999, the first petition by conservation groups and biologists was submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service, because under the ESA, citizens can petition to get a species looked at for protection under ESA. In 1999 was the first listing petition. And there was a series of more petitions for different subspecies throughout 2000 and 2003. And things started to rumble. 2003, 2005, there started to be, sage-grouse, when you kind of need to pay attention. It's a bird that's hunted. Let's start limiting the hunting season, and let's start reducing the harvest amount, the amount of birds that be killed, and other things. But nothing really was happening. Things were bubbling, but nothing really was happening to protect the sage-grouse or the sagebrush sea. And in 2004, WAFWA, Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, so that's all the agencies as a group, they came up with a conservation assessment. They stepped back and said, all right, let's take a look at this. And in a word, their assessment said, in terms of population decline for greater sage-grouse, the future does not look optimistic unless the habitat degradation and fragmentation is halted. In 2005, finally Fish and Wildlife Service responded to the listing petitions that were stacking up starting in 1999. And they responded, and they found that, despite the population graph that I showed you, that the sage-grouse was not warranted for protection under the ESA. Kind of shocking, given the evidence. Well, this was 2005, and President Bush was in the White House. And the Assistant Deputy Secretary for Fish and Wildlife, a woman named Julie McDonald, who left in disgrace after 3 years, she was not a scientist, but ultimately left because she tampered with evidence. She would actually take her staff scientists' reports, scribble out science, and write in the margins. She would leak information to the industries, energy industry, about what was going on. Conservation groups sued, including mine, and in 2007, the court finally reversed and remanded that Fish and Wildlife Service decision that the sage-grouse was not warranted for protection under the Endangered Species Act, one of the most popular laws in this country. Americans, we love our wildlife, critters large and small, furry and not furry. And the court decision noted the political interference by Julie McDonald. So this is highly charged. That's why I'm going through the history here. It's highly charged. Protecting the sage-grouse and its habitat and all those species does mean that extractive industries do not get unfettered access to the west, and especially our public lands. In 2010, then, the Fish and Wildlife Service went back to the drawing board, and the Fish and Wildlife Service found that the sage grouse was warranted for protection under the ESA, but it was precluded. It was precluded because of higher priorities. The Fish and Wildlife Service, like any other agency, has a budget, and there's just almost so much you can do. So it was precluded for higher priorities. Well, the listing decision that found it warranted protection cited habitat loss and fragmentation, everything we've talked about, and inadequate regulatory mechanisms, which means, does anyone know what inadequate regulatory mechanisms are? Okay, wonky way of saying there's not enough rules and regulations to prevent the habitat loss and fragmentation. And so again, conservation groups sued over the precluded portion of that listing, my group included. And there was a settlement agreement with Fish and Wildlife Service, Wild Earth Guardians, and the Center for Biological Diversity in 2011. And just to know that part of that settlement agreement, the center, what we do is we do try to get species protected under the ESA if warranted. And the Fish and Wildlife Service was simply not doing its job. The petitions were stacking up and stacking up and stacking up. They were not moving through the system, not necessarily to get a warranted finding, but simply for the Fish and Wildlife Service to do its job. And as part of the settlement, a schedule was developed with the Fish and Wildlife Service that they would not find in any way, but just move through that backlog of listing petitions to come out with decisions. And the Fish and Wildlife, on that schedule, the Fish and Wildlife was scheduled to make a determination for the greater sage grouse. It already found that it was warranted, but precluded. So they had to come with a finding by the end of 2015. Either it was going to be listed for protection or not. Now, the ripples that were happening before and the state agencies working, now people are wide awake and out of bed, because an ESA listing to many is a scary thing. And so now things got into gear really, because now the world knew, all right, something's going to happen here. We've been kicking this can down the road for almost 2 decades now. Something's going to happen. So the BLM began in earnest the National Greater Sage Grouse Planning Strategy, and this was a Herculean task. And they did a good job, although I'm going to critique the plan. They really did, and they pulled in state agencies, and there were working groups, and they spent a lot of money, and they did a lot of science. Science papers began to pouring in. There was already a lot. National Technical Team report, Conservation Objective Team. They really engaged a huge, huge amount of scientists, and we know a lot about the sage grouse as a result of that. So the final sage grouse plans, and these final plans, just so everyone's clear, these are the Bureau of Land Management and National Forest Service plans. It covers 70 million acres of federal land, so that's what we're talking about. The state land, which is about 5% of its habitat, and the private land, about 40% of the whole sagebrush sea, those are covered under separate state plans. So I'm referring to here the federal plans on public land. And what they did essentially is they took all the habitat, that map I showed you of the current range, and they sort of divided it out into focal, priority, and general areas. And I have maps. And they did it based on science that showed the density of bird breeding populations, from the most dense, where there are a lot of birds, out to where there are fewer birds. And that, that's a reasonable approach for conservation biology, concentrate where there is the highest amount of birds. And the focal receives the highest degree of protection, the priority less so, and the general areas, literally no meaningful protections at all. And there was a whole set of rules for exclusions for certain type of development, avoidance areas, which means try to avoid, but if you can't, you actually can go there. That's one of the squishy loopholes we see. And even with all that, habitat loss will continue. And there are some good things about the plan. There was in the SFAs, the special focal areas, there are 10 million acres where hard rock minerals will be withdrawn. Whether or not there actually are a lot of hard rock minerals there, we don't know, but at least that type of degradation in at least a small part of the habitat will be precluded. So There are some major flaws in the plan, and while the plan did implement lek buffers, so we saw the lek where the grouse gather around where the guys try to track the girls and get a date, and there are, the science is pretty robust. In other words, we know, and this is hundreds of papers, to what degree disturbance ripples out. Birds will abandon leks if there is noise, fragmentation, roads, industrialization, et cetera. And we know to what degree, how far out you have to go so that an area won't be disturbed by a bird. About 4 miles outside of a lek is one metric. So the plans did include a whole series of metrics about how tall fences have to be, et cetera, where right-of-ways for transmission can go. So there is a lot of good things about the plan. But the first thing was in missing the best available science, and that's the key point is here. The science is over here. The plans before had no science. The federal plans moved to about here, but the science for what the birds needs is over here. And at the end of the day, this is about science and what it will take to protect the bird. And that's the gap I'll speak to. So first, the plans omitted millions of acres of priority habitat. One of the, I talked before about the COT report, which basically looked at where all the birds breed and their densities. And this is a map. All these dots are basically the brighter the color, the red and the green, the highest density of bird concentration, the lighter colors, the lower density. And this COT team of Western wildlife agencies, like that fellow you saw on the tape, basically identified what they call PACs, priority areas for conservation. And they divided all the birds into quartiles, 25%, breaking down 100% of the population into quartiles. And they wanted to identify priority areas for conservation with the greatest percent. And that was science number one, protect all priority areas for conservation, or PACs. This map shows the green and all the different shades of green is what wound up in priority habitat. The red and the pink is what didn't wind up in priority habitat. So from the very first step, very important areas, including high concentration areas, were deleted from the final plans and their category of priority habitat. And visually, you could just see there's a lot of pink and red in the map that got left out. Winter habitat. You saw that biologists out there in the freezing cold with the snow. Sage grouse go to higher elevation areas. They need the food during the winter, so they need to find a place where the sagebrush is high above the snow. Often, birds from several leks concentrate around one winter area. And these sage grouse are highly loyal to their sites, their lekking sites and their winter sites. They don't leave easily. And the male birds will actually come back years and years and years, even though there's no females there. That's how loyal they are to their site. So winter habitats are so important because there's fewer of them, but in terms of the bird's life cycle, they are critical. So for example, in the plans, seasonal protection for winter habitat, let's just not do oil and gas drilling during the season in the winter when the birds are there. But next year, it's okay to put a drilling well there. Well, that's not adequate because next winter, the birds will return and their winter habitat will be degraded. Those are the kinds of things I'm talking about in the final plans. Winter habitat did not get addressed, does not have adequate protections. And that is essential for the survival of the bird. They indefinitely postponed changes in livestock. And this is a political hot button. And by now, I'm sure you've surmised just the whole political turmoil of this whole planning effort. There is attention to cheatgrass, and there's an acknowledgement that it leads to wildfire, which, by the way, tax dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on putting out fires in the sagebrush sea each year, so that's also our tax dollars. Yet the plans don't recognize the fact that livestock is a root cause. And while the plans finally have some habitat future desired conditions, a certain amount of grass height, there's no mechanism in the plans to actually trigger when these changes will occur. So you look at the plan, you say, wow, desired future condition, this looks great, 7-inch grass height, this is terrific, seasonal rotation, except that they don't require the cows to be taken off during nesting season, and there is no actual mechanism in the plan to require those changes to take place. Failure to close priority habitats to future oil, gas, coal, and extraction. So the National Technical Team, which was one of the scientific bodies that got together to look at peer-reviewed studies, said that for new areas should be closed to future oil and gas drilling. And the plans didn't do that, and they have failure to apply strong protections to existing valid rights. There are existing valid rights for oil and gas claims, but yet there are still things that the plans can do. And failure to protect connectivity. Got my red card here. So the USGS, the scientific arm of the Department of Interior, call the plans a grand experiment. They have risks, and that isolation, because there's so much fragmentation, could lead to loss of sage-grouse habitat. A quick word about Wyoming. Wyoming is the exception to all the other plans, and it's followed the state's solution. Each state came up with a state plan. Ultimately, the BLM analyzed it in the EIS. They did not accept them. And Wyoming allows drilling and breeding in nesting areas right in the nesting and breeding, 0.6 lek buffer. The science says they need 4-mile lek buffer around non-disturbed lek buffer. 60% more disturbance than the science found the species can tolerate is allowed in Wyoming. And the winter habitat they can treat, means remove vegetation, just don't reduce the canopy to less than 15%. So in the end, we are glad the plants are here. We don't want to see them removed. We want to see them made stronger, and there are avenues for that. And extinction doesn't get a second chance. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for having me here today. I'm Trip Parks with the Western Energy Alliance. I flew in from Denver very late last night, thanks to some bad weather. Appreciate the very dynamic introduction we got to the species. It is a species I deal with on a daily basis, and I don't know that I can speak with that much enthusiasm on the topic, but I appreciated that. And I thought that was a great presentation from Randy, so thank you all for having me. Western Energy Alliance, we're a trade association. We represent about 450 companies involved in exploration and development in the West. So that is kind of my background. I've been dealing with the sage grouse now for not nearly as long as Randy, but like I said, on basically a daily basis for a long time now. So let's start with the good news. The numbers we heard in the YouTube video from Tom and in Randy's presentation stopped around 2012, 2013. Good news is WAFWA, as Randy introduced it, which is the Association of Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Wyoming Game and Fish, state agencies, has found a 63% increase in the population in the last 3 years. We're going in the right direction. That's the key takeaway that I'm going to make in my presentation today. So, why does this matter for Western Energy Alliance and our member companies? These pictures are a little hard to read. They're not exactly HD, but basically what you see on the right is sage grouse. On the left is where you have oil and gas in the West. You might notice there's a pretty remarkable overlap there. There's certainly competing interests, you might say. So with that, I want to talk about first of all, what oil and gas companies have been doing. We're going to kind of go through the steps, the background, take a step back, and talk about, outside of the federal plans, what's really going on the ground, happening on the ground. So the key takeaway from this slide, this is a SWCA study. I'm looking at the third paragraph there. SWCA is an environmental consultant firm. They did a study of 103 oil and gas NEPA documents. Now, NEPA is the National Environmental Protection Act. It requires project-specific documents that outline your planning, your approach, how you are going to deal with, in this instance, sage grouse. These NEPA documents, they analyzed 103, found 773 total conservation measures, 6.5 per project. And just to give you an idea of what those are, we're talking about seasonal timing and spatial restrictions, got reclamation, traffic reduction, noise reduction. These are specific to a project. These are from the Bureau of Land Management. They are the federal government working, cooperating in a very personal way with the oil and gas companies who are on the ground to make sure that the companies are not doing, or that are, the companies are doing the best they can to protect and conserve this bird. And I want to also go back to a picture that Randy showed from, I believe it was 2004, of oil and gas development in Wyoming. One of the big things we've seen in the last decade has been the rise of horizontal drilling as opposed to vertical drilling. In Randy's picture, you saw probably 16 to 20 different well pads. Today, all 16 of those would be on the same well pad, an area not much bigger than the size of, say, this room. It's incredible the technological advances that are happening. And these are the kind of advances that are, in the long term, going to work out for the benefit of the bird. And as the third paragraph shows, a study was done and published in, I forget which journal it was, I apologize, but found that we're talking about up to 70% less disturbance of the area. So these are the steps that oil and gas companies have been taking. But they're not alone. State conservation efforts have been a key component of the growth you've seen in the last 3 years, and really, in my view, in Western Energy Alliance's view, and a lot of the people who live out in the West, like I do in Denver, these are the answers. So, as it says, over the past few decades, there have been 180 state efforts to conserve the bird. $200 million in the last decade from states alone. And I put up an example there of Governor Bullock's signature for his plan. Montana has the executive order number 1024. Nevada established a sagebrush ecosystem council. The Colorado developed its conservation plan in 2008, updated in 2012. This is happening all across the West. The 11 states where the sage grouse currently populated, all states have a plan in place to address this bird. And yes, I think it's probably accurate to say that Randy's efforts to get the bird listed led us to where we are today. There's no doubt that the states are taking concerted action in response to the threat of a listing. But what those concerted actions are doing is leading to that 60% population increase we've seen in the last 3 years. This is an example of what's going on in Wyoming. And as Randy said, Wyoming is kind of a special case. Wyoming is the one state where BLM really worked with the state, followed the plan, stuck with it in their final land use plan. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about a 0.6 mile, no surface occupancy around Lex. And this is something certainly that Randy and I would disagree on. We believe the science supports fully that that is an absolutely sufficient buffer around the Lex. When you get out in the West and you talk about 4 miles out in the sagebrush sea, how far away that is. We're talking about rolling hills and mountains. 4 miles is a long way to sea for a bird. We're also talking about timing restrictions, density restrictions, so you can only have so much in a certain area, 5% disturbance cap. These are the kind of things that Wyoming put in place, and these are the kind of things that the Bureau of Land Management accepted in Wyoming. Here we have, just for curiosity, what it looks like in Wyoming. This is from the Wyoming plan. This is what they established as the core areas for the bird. And this is incomplete, unfortunately, because this is from only one of the Wyoming plans. There are actually 3 Wyoming plans, which is why there's a lot of white. But you look at all the color in there. All the colors are restrictions. We're talking about red is closed, yellow is open with major restrictions, or orange with major stipulations, yellow with moderate, and green with just standard stipulations. You don't see a lot of green up there. You see a lot of yellow and a lot of red. This is a plan that puts severe restrictions on oil and gas development. So that's what the states are doing. That's what oil and gas is doing. What is the federal government doing? This is what we're here to talk about today. The land use plan amendments came out September 30th of last year. These are, and as you see the fancy glossed over cover there, these are the plans for the 98 field offices in the areas that are affected by the sage, or that are populated by sage-grouse. Within these plans, you have, as it says, lands available for leasing, stipulations, protection measures, mitigation, timing limitations. And again, these are what guide the project-level decisions within the planning area. But I want to emphasize that these are on top of and redundant to project-level planning documents. NEPA documents that have been in place for decades now that on a very specific basis tell you how you can operate. So, what are the goals of these plans? Stop population loss, get the habitat restored, proactive conservation, and we're going to come back to this because I want to talk about, excuse me, about the plans and how successful they are in achieving these goals. So, in Utah, like I said, a different strategy than Wyoming. Wyoming got their pretty much what they wanted from BLM. Utah did not, and Utah I'm going to use as an example, but it basically is the same for the other 9 states that were not included in the planning process. As it says, not tied to sage-grouse plan. Randy introduced these topics, the focal areas, the priority habitat, and the general habitat. And it's very important to understand the difference between these different areas and what effects they have. So, yeah, and I thought this might not show up as well, but basically what you're looking at is the blue kind of circled and highlighted. Those are focal areas. And, sorry, those are priority habitat management areas. And then the rest, the pink, is general habitat management areas. These, we have a very large amount of priority management areas. And this is another instance where we disagree on the science with Randy. We think that these are far too expansive and they are not based in sound science. Western Energy Alliance joined a coalition of counties from the West, a number of counties, as well as other stakeholders, in suing under the Data Quality Act, suing this science. We are currently involved in litigation saying that basically you're not doing your proper research, you're relying on flawed science, and we don't trust it. So, within the priority habitat and the focal areas, what do we have? 3.1 miles away from lakes. You'll remember in Wyoming that was 0.6, so we're talking 5 times as large. Now in Wyoming, 0.6 is okay. Everywhere else, 3.1. That's a pretty huge difference to say, oh, we accept the science in Wyoming, but we don't accept it elsewhere. 3% disturbance cap and density limitation. I didn't really highlight this in Wyoming, but in Wyoming it's 5%. This is a huge deal just in terms of that 2%, because there's a lot of work on the margin that goes in there. You're going to kill a lot of projects with the difference between 3% and 5%. You have to mitigate to provide a net conservation gain. This is a new term that's recently been introduced by the administration. Net conservation gain is not something that's been around for the life of the Endangered Species Act. This is something that was put in place last fall. Basically what it means is you can't disturb, let's say, an acre or an area the size of this room without making conservation improvements in an area that's much bigger than the size of this room. It's an overreaction. It is an attack, basically, on development of land. Finally, there are required design features. These are very specific, and I won't bore you with the details, but basically specific ways that you can put in place your well. That was inevitable. Also in this priority habitat, you have seasonal no surface occupancy, noise restrictions. And what's important here is Randy said that these priority habitat, you are basically not protecting, or you're not affecting valid existing leases. We would argue the opposite. We would argue that these plans make it so that valid existing leases, rights that are held in a contract with the government, are going to be made completely uneconomic, and they're going to be having to give up those rights. In general habitat, it's, we're talking about less critical habitat for the bird. So I won't bore you with going over these again, but basically they're slightly less strict, but they are generally about the same concepts. So the results, what does this all mean? Well, first of all, we're talking about job losses. We're talking about disincentives to state and local efforts. We're talking about taking money away from the people on the ground doing the actual conservation. Because realistically, it is the state, local governments, the people who send their wildlife biologists out into the field, who work with the oil and gas companies, with the grazers, everyone who is actually living in these areas. They're the ones who are doing the actual conservation. As I showed earlier, 773 conservation efforts on oil and gas projects from a very limited set of projects. We commissioned an economic study that shows a range of job losses up to 18,000 and up to almost $5 billion in total economic output. Of that $5 billion, you're talking about state and local taxes. Taxes that fund conservation efforts on the ground. Taxes that fund the position within the Colorado Parks and Wildlife that allow you to have those biologists on the ground. So really what we're talking about is an overarching federal program that's coming in and saying, we in DC, we know better how to manage the sage-grouse. We know how to protect it. And what we're going to do is we're going to put in a plan range-wide, and we're going to expand the areas where the bird needs to be conserved far beyond what it needs. We're going to put in place incredibly restrictive restrictions on development of oil and gas, on agriculture, and on all kinds of human activity for those who are actually, like I said, on the ground there working to conserve the bird. So, unsurprisingly, you get to that last line there. Utah, Nevada, and Idaho have sued the federal government. This is not oil and gas companies suing the federal government. This is not big, bad, big oil. These are the states where the sage-grouse is actually in habitat. They've said, look, what you've done here goes far beyond your authority under the Endangered Species Act. Realistically, Fish and Wildlife Service is the one charged with managing the Endangered Species Act. Bureau of Land Management has put in place these plans way beyond their authority because Fish and Wildlife Service decided not to list the bird, which we think was a great outcome. But the plans themselves contain so many flaws that the states are pushing back and saying, look, we have plans, we have efforts that are actually affecting the bird. The 60% increase in the last 3 years is a result of our plans, and you, the federal government, you're encroaching on our rights. So with that, I'll probably turn it over and we'll have a little back and forth question time.
Can I make a suggestion? Why don't we line up behind where there are 3 mics, and that way we can interact and respond to you as well. Make sense? What? I'd like to see if we can narrow dialogue a little. Could we agree here among ourselves that at the present time the sage-grouse is endangered or threatened? At the present time?
No, I think Fish and Wildlife Service found very clearly that it's not by avoiding listing.
No, that's not true.
That's not true.
They found that it was warranted for listing biologically, but there were reasons not to list in these coming plans. That's different, isn't it? Doesn't mean it's not endangered. In fact, they've never made a no danger. The only time they made a no danger, wasn't it? They were beaten in court. That was the not warranted.
Right.
So they've never gone back that road. So what you're seeing here is not, I thought we'd reached agreement on this. You've got a bird that's in trouble. We can agree that. And we've got 2 sets of plans dealing with it, state plans and federal plans. So come back to, I'm not picking and trip, I just want to try to see if we can narrow the dialogue again. 51% of this bird's habitat is on federal land. Are you saying that there's no need for federal land management for the bird because the state plans exist?
Is that towards me?
Yep.
I think I said in my presentation that there's absolutely management, federal management of the bird in project-specific NEPA documents. This is going on. There are land use plans in each field office that address how you develop oil and gas, how you develop agriculture, and these are not going away because the bird was not listed.
Let me assure you that those plans do not specifically address, and those of us who are environmentally law educated and know that NEPA imposes no environmental requirements on any agency other than write an impact statement. So nothing derives from NEPA that protects the grouse.
That may have been true 5-10 years ago, but on the ground today in Colorado, in the last year, the Royal Gorge Field Office, the White River Field Office have updated their resource management plans. Each of them have contained specific provisions for the greater sage-grouse and plenty of other species that are included in the planning area that are endangered, threatened, or not.
Is what the federal government's doing here different from that? They're saying that we want in sage-grouse habitat, on these forests in this region, the following requirements. And we're going to standardize those requirements rather than leave it up to a bazaar every time somebody comes up with a plan for this or a plan for that. Here are the rules. So they're setting the rules. Is that what you're objecting to?
No, I have no objection to the BLM managing the grouse and putting in place these plans. We say the plans go too far. I'm happy to say that the plans are legitimate in the sense that BLM has the right to construct them.
Okay. I want to move to the too far, and then I'll shut up. No, I won't. But again, I'm trying to understand where the ships miss. And if what we're really talking about is the feds have the right to do this, you're already departing from Butch Otter and from the governor of Utah and the rest who say the feds have no right to do this. They've exceeded their authority, and therefore, feds go home. In fact, Utah is taking the position the feds have no right to own the public lands anyway. At least we're at the point of accepting that these federal land managers have the responsibilities to manage the land to protect the grouse. And so the only question is, have they gone too far in their requirements? Not have they gone too far exceeding their authority to protect the grouse. Is that right? They've got the authority.
The devil's in the details.
Sure. Okay. Now, one of those details you pointed out was that they were protecting the grouse in areas outside areas that they presently occupied. Is that correct?
Far outside of it, yes.
Far outside. Tom, you want to speak to that biologically?
And how do you
Is it
define
necessary
occupy?
to protect areas outside what they presently occupy, and why would that be?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you're asking me to address, but
I'm asking you to address the question of the protection of habitat. The birds are over here in this part of the room. They used to be over here in this part of the room. Now they're not. Is it important to protect this area as well as this area?
Well, what is striking to me is a couple of things, is that the plan is now focusing on protecting the bird in a part of the range, which is a fragment of what it occupied at one point.
Yeah.
So yes, that is correct, that it at best would protect a fragment of the original habitat that they happen to still find suitable. I think a point that Randy made also is very important here, in that I think everything Tripp spoke about, but please address this, focused on the leks and not the winter needs of the bird. And that was striking to me. And do the state plans address the winter habitat, and how? I mean, I think that's a critical biological issue.
Thanks. Oh, but you'll get your turn
Yeah.
for sure. You know, that is important, and these plans just don't actually focus on historic, just the current range, and a subset of that range at that. That's what I was trying to point out in the maps of current range, and it went from general habitat, priority habitat, focal areas, and with that map with the pink and green dots. I was trying to point out that it's not just historic range, but they've actually really shrunk the currently occupied habitat for protective measures. And it's not just winter. So let me just get to the lek buffer. This is important because the sage grouse, they, on the lek, that open area that we saw in that video, is where they do their mating dance. Then, in a radius 4, sometimes even 5 or more miles, that's where the females nest, where they hide their eggs until they hatch, and where they rear their broods. And so the Wyoming plan, which is the state plan, which was really a political deal. I mean, let's just, there's zero science on 0.6 mile buffers. In fact, the 0.6 mile, here's my point, protects where the male leks. So that's great. All right, nothing going to happen in that 0.6 mile. But now when the mom wants to lay her eggs in that area outside the lek, hide them from predators, etc., all the way up to the 4 miles, there's no protection. Wyoming is where 39% of the birds are, probably the largest, most intact. So protecting the lek, big points. Where they nest and brood and raise their chicks and go for the winter, you can't have a species survive. That's sort of like, I'll have an analogy here, but I can't think of a good one. The point is, that's like you protect your bedroom, but there's no food in the refrigerator and there's no roof over your head.
It's more like there's an all-male world, right? We're going to propagate with protected males on the legs.
Right, but
Right.
you're on your own with that one, because that's not going to work very well.
No, I mean it's not going to. Trip, did you want to come back on that question of the adequacy of the rings of protection that Ricky and Tom have mentioned?
Well, I would probably try and clarify that what we're saying is that the priority habitat and the focal areas are incorrect. We're saying that the science behind those is too or not the science behind the science behind those says they are too expansive, that they're far too large compared to actual on the ground what the focal areas are, what the priority habitat is. And that has a big impact because there's a big difference between what you can do in priority and what you can do in general.
Except that those studies where those buffer distances came from, that was all based on on-the-ground research. It's not modeling. All based on on-the-ground research, hundreds of papers peer-reviewed, aggregated together. That was the NTT, the National Technical Team Report.
Which is the report that we
USGS.
have sued on and which we are hoping to take to court pretty soon.
Well, the judge will decide with your Data Quality Act. And I also wanted to mention, because there is reams and reams of science on this, and we can go chapter and verse, but yes, the judge will ultimately decide on your Data Quality Act. But it's on the ground research. And the other thing, too, in regard to your population numbers, so this is true, the latest count of males and then the total populations extrapolated was up 63% from 2013 to 15. Sage grouse cycles go through cyclical times. It was a very wet year, and that's natural cycling of the bird. But one data point in time does not a trend make. And during the time that these plans were being developed, 5.1 million acres of oil and gas potential development was put on hold by the Bureau of Land Management on public lands and said, wait, you cannot go forward with any more drilling or fracking until we get these plans together in place. So during that period of time, also, the floodgates of oil and gas were held back. Now they're going to open up. And so I just wanted to qualify. The other thing, too, about sage grouse is because they're crazy loyal to their lek sites and their whole nesting and breeding areas, the male birds will sometimes hang on. There was a development, the reservoir flooded a lek. Those male birds came back year after year and did their dance on the frozen lake as a lek. The point is there's a 7 to 10 lag period in the biology of greater sage grouse. So you won't see the effect totally. The males may come back, but then there's not enough females, and then there's not enough nesting success and reproduction success. So just, I hope that the population continues to go up, but I'm just putting a caveat on one data point. Like anything else in time will tell, and there is a lag time with the biology of the greater sage grouse. I also wanted to add that
Can I just add to
yes.
that point? This is the same issue as with climate change and climate change denial. I mean, people see a temporary uptick in or downtick in the temperature, and then they say, wow, things are better than we thought. But with the grouse, I think you must look at the long-term trend. You can't look at just a year or two pattern. It's the same fallacy as drawing conclusions about climate change based on a short time window.
We have so few minutes remaining. You've been very patient. You must have comments or questions, and if you do, this is the opportunity, ma'am.
I was curious about your views as to the efficacy of candidate conservation agreements. Those of you that are familiar with the Endangered Species Act, this is one of the things that's used when there are candidate species in an area.
Ma'am, that's what we're talking about, candidate conservation agreement.
Preclude or prevent or postpone listing because of many private parties, whatever their activities, would much prefer to work in a more flexible environment than have a species listed with the draconian take prohibition.
No, it's true. The countervailing is that unless you get buy-in from the private parties, the private community, and the states, the feds can't do it alone. So it's a trade-off. You're trading greater buy-in for less firm protection. That's a risk. And if it's a bad risk, i.e. it's a bad plan, so you really get less protection, the grouse is done.
Well, there've been a lot of CCAs incident to the
yeah.
sage grouse, and I wondered, for those of you who are more involved in it, do you think they have contributed to the possibility of having this plan go forward?
Do we have optimism
No,
that
I
the
mean,
plan's
do
going to
you
work?
feel that the private sector's participation with the CCAs has been a beneficial contribution?
You know, there's a remarkable article I commend to you, which is in the back on this big bird.
On high country.
Very thorough rundown of the cooperative agreements between the federal government and the states here. And there are some considerable success stories. They're not yet reflected in population trends unless they're responsible for some of this. Do I think people will cooperate and do what they say they will do? Yes, I think so. Particularly if the hammer of listing is still over their head. Without the hammer of the ESA, nothing like this would be happening, right? The grouse would be something. So we can start with that. Yes, sir, in the back.
Are the reasons for the spikes in male population understood? And a related question would be how much of the present increase can be attributed to the plan?
Well, I'd probably start by saying that none of the present increase can be attributed to the plans because the plans were only released last fall. We're talking about population before the plan's released.
The federal plans have just kicked in.
Yeah.
The state plans were rope-a-doping along prior to this.
And my argument is that the state plans, the state conservation efforts, and the private efforts are what have led to this increase. And to be clear, we don't think it's all fixed. You know, one data point in time certainly does not say, all right, we've done it, we're good here. This is an ongoing effort. This will be an ongoing effort. The planning documents usually last for 20 years to 25 years before they're updated. These are going to be in place for a long time. So we're going to have plenty of time to monitor where this is going, what the population is doing. And I want to go back real quick to a point Randy made about stopping the avalanche of development on federal lands and how now the floodgates are open. I don't know how many of you have filled up your gas tank recently, but there's not going to be a whole bunch of development on federal lands right now because nobody's developing. Oil and gas companies can't go out and drill, and even if they do, these are long-term plans. These are monitored by BLM, which is charged with a multi-use approach to managing federal lands. They are responsible for allowing oil and gas development, responsible oil and gas development that funds BLM conservation efforts. So I just want to make that point clear.
Oh, that's a mouthful. I'll let that go. Sir?
Okay.
Please.
So we were talking a lot about habitat fragmentation. One thing that I'd like your views on is I think there's 15 plans total.
Right.
We now have regulatory fragmentation. Presumably, ESA would have applied uniformly across all the states. Well, here we're looking at Wyoming losing sage grouse. This plan's not effective enough. Perhaps Utah loses its lawsuit. They'll be able to keep sage grouse. But I'm just wondering, wouldn't a uniform playing field be better for both the bird and regulated interests? Because I presume Utah, or Wyoming thinks it has a competitive advantage over Colorado now.
Should I answer that?
Yeah, I'm on thoughts. Go ahead.
Great. So that's a very good question because, one of the reasons this plan was undertaken, and it is 15 different plans, but you saw all the maps. It's the first time really a range-wide ecosystem approach was looked at because birds do move around. And to your point about the project level approach, just looking at each project level failed. And I think the population trends point that out, that collectively there's not been a success. Looking at the landscape level to assess the cumulative impact as well as the genetic interchange, connectivity is important. One of the things, as a weakness in the plan, exactly as your point, of these 15 plans, there's of course similarities, but they vary greatly, and that's because there were different deals cut, not because there were biological differences, but really just frankly different deals cut. Look, the Wyoming plan, that was a deal with Wyoming. And I could talk about probably why that happened outside the room. But there's nothing about that that is scientifically sound.
One of the problems with the state plans is unless there is some oversight and commonality, there's going to be a race to the bottom. I mean, why should we be restricting our industry here if you're not restricting it there? So to rely on state plans alone is a really slender reed.
Well, I think that's ignoring, though, again, what I said about the field offices who have in place the resource management plans for their planning areas. The project-specific NEPA documents are a product of the...
I wasn't talking about federal.
Oh, I know.
About state plans.
Yeah, I know. And I'm saying what you're forgetting is that the White River Field Office has a resource management plan for its planning area that takes into account sage grouse.
The old one or the new one?
The new one.
Yes, of course it does. That's right. They all do.
Yes.
But they
Which
don't
means if-
recognize the biology uniformly. That's the point. That they don't recognize, that's this gentleman's point, is that, the grouse biological needs really does not differ much across the range, and therefore there should be some uniform standards which a listing under the ESA and the biological opinion would have had. And I think that's what that gentleman is talking about.
And I would say that each planning area is different. There are 98 planning areas within the 15 plans, 98 field offices. And the situation on the ground is different in Pinedale in Wyoming than it is in Utah.
The distance that a lack or a nesting area of non-disturbance is going to differ in this habitat, right? Unique habitat is going to differ from state to state. That is
Well,
to
if
say,
they'd followed
0.6
Wyoming,
miles- 0.6 miles in Wyoming is fine, and 4 miles in another state is required. I mean,
no, it should be 0.6 everywhere, absolutely.
well,
That's
if
the
the science.
science.
If the science drives you to 4, it should be 4.
Well, if
Clearly,
BLM accepted 0.6 in Wyoming, based on the science. So why,
accepted 0.6 because it was a political deal cut with the Wyoming governor. Come on, let's be realistic about this.
And they cut, yeah, and who's pushing the Wyoming governor hard here? Yeah.
So back to candidate conservation agreements, this question is from Mr. Parks. It seems that these agreements, both for private landowners and for industry whom you represent, are clearly preferable, at least from your perspective, to formal listing under the Endangered Species Act. So my question is, if there are any circumstances, or if you think that there would be a mechanism for ensuring on the front end the success of the candidate conservation agreement, meaning that would industry and private individuals, those who you represent, accept as part of this decision to not list some type of, perhaps say, if the population declines below a certain level, X, Y, or Z, formal listing perhaps happens?
well, I want to say that there is a policy in place, we call it the peace policy. It's the policy for evaluating conservation efforts. And what it does is it really plays a big role in the lesser prairie chicken, less so in the sage grouse here. But basically what the policy, the peace policy
Those
does.
only to evaluate the conservation measures in the candidate conservation agreement,
Right.
though, projected success. I'm talking
Question,
about
should anything be
demonstrably.
required to happen?
Right.
If peace says going down, is there any objective measure in these state plans that says, okay, we will do X?
A trigger.
There are hard and soft triggers in the plan as part of adaptive management. They're not specific to CCAAs, but there are hard and soft triggers in each of these plans.
Are we
for
talking about the BLM plan or the
Yes,
state plan?
BLM plans.
I'm not talking federal, I'm talking state, because the answer that you have given is that we don't need the feds to weigh in on a landscape level basis because the state plans are gonna do the job. But if the state plans are not enforceable and don't have triggers, that's a high risk to take for the feds laying off. Yep.
God forbid, but should a Republican win the next election, looking at the field that they have, will,
What could you be
Tripp
referring
Tripp
to?
won't even accept he won't even accept the predicate. And he's perfectly
will the
entitled.
states then more or less, these states gut their plans? Because none of these states, all of these states are Tea Party Republican places. Colorado.
Yeah, I'd say Tea Party Republicans is a little far. They're Republican states. Colorado's a Democratic state, and I would say that as was discussed earlier, the knife of a listing under the ESA is always there. It's not going away.
Yeah, but if a Republican gets in, there's a snowball's chance in hell that they'll list. But I mean, that's just a reality.
Well,
With regard to the state plan's predicated on the Wyoming governor's executive order. The first thing a new president of the United States does coming in is review all of his predecessors' executive orders, and some they throw out, they repeal. And so it's hardly a firm basis. A collateral question on that is, over the years, what has kept the ESA straight is not various administrations, but citizen suit enforcement. So, I mean, they're the reason the thing is listed in the first place. So my question is, with the state plans, are they enforceable by outside parties? If things don't get hit, can anybody go to Wyoming and say, here's the law, you got to obey it? Could the Center for Biological Diversity sue who for not meeting the standards of the Wyoming plan or not complying with the Wyoming plan? Is that actionable?
On the private lands,
Yeah. Is
Well,
it law that these things will happen?
we could always sue. The question is, can you win?
But is it law?
Um,
If you could prove factually that the Wyoming plan was not meeting its targets or otherwise inadequate,
I believe,
or they
yes.
simply weren't building within, leaving an adequate buffer,
Yes, I believe we can because, and that a lawsuit like that could prevail because, a very important point, when the Fish and Wildlife Service, they basically didn't rule that the species is warranted right now because of the federal, the microphone's on, because of the federal land management plans and because of the state plans. So the Fish and Wildlife Service basically said this last round, I think that was your question before, I think the Fish and Wildlife Service said this last round, look, we know the birds population is this, we have put in place adequate regulatory mechanisms, remember that was the second reason, and so here are the BLM plans, the Forest Service plans, and the state plans. But if those plans do not get carried out, then a listing would be warranted. Dan Ash said that very clearly. If any one of these pieces fall out, then it will be reviewed for
that's half
listing.
the answer. The other half of the answer is the Wyoming plan, the Utah plan, whatever those plans are, qua state law. Can anyone sue in those states to enforce the elements of those plans? Are those plans law in those states? Your recourse is simply to list, but that's a recourse with some really nasty limitations.
Right.
It's the last thing you want, it's the last thing that a Tripp wants. Listing means defeat. So if that's the case, are the state plans themselves enforceable? We've got these terms, we're going to stay away from the Lex this far, we're going to do this, suppose they don't.
You know, if they're voluntary, then they're not enforceable, and
Are
that's,
they voluntary?
well, you can answer better on the state plans. I know that many of them are. I'm familiar with Utah, and they're voluntary.
That's what I think.
Yes, that's correct. Well, voluntary in the sense that the states have voluntarily created them. And these are not,
But participation
These
by
are-
the affected parties is voluntary.
Is voluntary.
yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Right.
So they can or cannot without any penalty or oversight or anything like
Oh,
that.
no, I'm sorry, I'm mishearing your question. The policies that are being put in place by the states are enforceable by the states themselves. They're not voluntary. These are restrictions within the states
And private
that are managed by, that are, governed by the states,
By state law?
by state policy.
Ooh, law and policy, yeah. Yeah, right.
So, we saw this kind of inspiring people coming together to get this plan out, and then states, industry turn around and challenge it in court. I'm wondering from both of you, Randy and Tripp, why would the feds come to the table for something like this again? Why should they?
Well, we'll see what happens in the courts before they make that decision.
They've already had to expend the energy defending the lawsuits. I mean, if the plan was to make this work for everyone, and then as soon as it's set, no one's happy with it anymore, I mean, has it worked? Did it meet the goals of the original idea?
No.
I have a,
Yes, no, I disagree.
I have a question for Tripp. What happens if your lawsuit succeeds? What happens with a grouse?
Well,
It gets rescued by the states.
the court
It doesn't-
system.
If that lawsuit succeeds, that greatly weakens the federal government's hand unless we go to the ESA.
That's the point of it. That's the point of it. They want it with the states.
All right.
100%.
I think that it is now lunchtime, so we give a big round of applause.